Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. The disturbing case of Benjamin Ward, the man who couldn't die. In the spring of 1883, deep within the rugged hills of the Missouri Ozarks, there lived a man who defied every law of nature that governed life and death. His name was Benjamin Daniel Ward, and by all accounts, he should have died at least a dozen times before his 21st birthday. Yet there he stood, breathing, walking, and living in a way that made his neighbors whisper behind closed doors and cross themselves when his shadow fell across their path. This isn't a story about miracles or divine intervention. This isn't a tale of medical anomalies or scientific breakthroughs. This is something far more unsettling, a case that challenges everything we think we know about mortality itself. And it all began in one of the most isolated, unforgiving landscapes in 19th century America. The Missouri Ozarks of 1883 were not a place for the weak. These weren't the tame, tourist-friendly hills you might visit today around Branson or Springfield. No, this was a harsh frontier wilderness, where survival depended on more than just skill and determination. It required a kind of stubborn resilience that few possessed, and even fewer could maintain when death came calling. But Benjamin Ward seemed to dance with death as easily as other men danced with their wives at Saturday night socials. Born on a cold April morning in 1868 to William Henry Ward and Laura Jennings, Benjamin entered the world during one of the harshest winters the Ozarks had seen in decades. His father, William, was a man carved from the same tough oak that dotted the hillsides. A blacksmith by trade and a farmer by necessity, William had come to Missouri from Tennessee after the Civil War, seeking land that no one else wanted and peace that no one else could find. Laura Jennings Ward was different. She carried herself with a quiet grace that seemed almost out of place in the rough-hewn world of the Ozark frontier. The daughter of a traveling preacher who had settled in the region during the 1850s, she possessed an education that was rare among frontier women and an intuition that bordered on the supernatural. Neighbors would later claim that Laura somehow knew, from the moment Benjamin drew his first breath, that her son would be marked by forces beyond their understanding. The Ward family homestead sat nestled in a hollow about 15 miles northeast of what would eventually become Springfield, Missouri. It was accessible only by a narrow dirt trail that wound through dense stands of oak, hickory, and pine. During the winter months, that trail became impassable, cutting the family off from the outside world for weeks at a time. During the spring thaws, it turned into a treacherous, muddy channel that had claimed more than one wagon and team. But isolation wasn't unusual in the Ozarks. What was unusual was the way young Benjamin seemed to attract danger like iron filings to a magnet, and then somehow slip away from death's grasp, time and time again. The first incident that people still talked about decades later occurred when Benjamin was barely 3 years old. It was late autumn of 1871, and William Ward was preparing for winter by cutting firewood in the dense forest that surrounded their property. Like most frontier children, Benjamin was expected to stay close to the cabin while his father worked. But on this particular afternoon, curiosity got the better of him. According to Laura's account, which she shared with her sister in a letter that survived in family records, Benjamin simply vanished. One moment he was playing with wooden blocks on the cabin's front porch, and the next, he was gone. Laura searched frantically around the homestead, calling his name until her voice grew hoarse. When William returned at sunset, they organized every able-bodied person within 10 miles to search for the missing child. The Missouri Ozarks in 1871 were home to black bears, mountain lions, timber wolves, and copperheads that could kill a grown man with a single bite. A 3-year-old child alone in that wilderness after dark had virtually no chance of survival. The temperature that night dropped to near freezing, and a cold rain began to fall just after midnight. They found Benjamin the next morning, nearly 18 hours after he had disappeared. He was sitting calmly beside Big Sugar Creek, about 3 miles from the family cabin, completely unharmed and apparently unbothered by his night in the wilderness. When they asked him what had happened, he simply said that he had followed a pretty lady who had shown him where the water was sweetest and had sung to him through the night to keep him warm. There was no sign of any woman in the area. The searchers had covered every inch of ground between the cabin and the creek. More puzzling still, Benjamin's clothes were completely dry despite the rainfall, and his body temperature was normal despite the near-freezing conditions. Dr. Matthias Cohn, the only trained physician within 50 miles, examined the boy and found no signs of exposure, dehydration, or distress. The incident might have been dismissed as childhood imagination if not for what happened next. Within a week of Benjamin's mysterious night by the creek, 3 separate families in the area reported similar encounters. Their children, Dren, ranging in age from 4 to 12, claimed to have seen a woman in white walking through the forest near Big Sugar Creek. 2 of the children said she had spoken to them, warning them to stay away from certain areas of the woods. One 8-year-old girl swore that the woman had pulled her back from a deep sinkhole that she hadn't seen in the gathering dusk. But these incidents, strange as they were, paled in comparison to what would happen to Benjamin Ward over the following years. The encounter by Big Sugar Creek was just the beginning of a pattern that would define his entire life and leave everyone who knew him questioning the very nature of mortality itself. The Missouri Ozarks of the 1880s were a world apart from the rapidly industrializing cities of the East Coast. While New York and Philadelphia were installing electric streetlights and constructing massive steel bridges, the Ozark region remained stubbornly locked in an earlier era. Roads were little more than dirt paths that became impassable during heavy rains. Communication with the outside world depended on a handful of mail routes that operated on irregular schedules. Medical care was primitive at best and often non-existent. This isolation bred a culture that was uniquely its own. The people of the Ozarks were fiercely independent, deeply suspicious of outsiders, and steeped in traditions that stretched back to their Scottish and Irish ancestors. They were also remarkably superstitious, though they would never have used that word to describe their beliefs. To them, the world was full of forces that couldn't be explained by logic or reason, and survival often depended on recognizing and respecting those forces. Folk medicine thrived in this environment. Healers known as granny women, or root doctors, treated everything from broken bones to broken hearts, using remedies passed down through gene rations. They could brew teas from wild ginseng and golden seal to fight infection, create poultices from plantain and comfrey to heal wounds, and prepare tinctures from dozens of native plants to treat ailments that would have baffled trained physicians. But even more important than their medical knowledge was their understanding of the spiritual world. These healers spoke of thin places, where the boundary between the living and the dead became permeable. They knew which hollows were blessed and which were cursed, which springs could heal and which could harm. They understood that some people were born with the sight or the touch, special gifts that allowed them to perceive and interact with forces that remained invisible to others. Religious belief in the Ozarks was intense and personal. Baptist and Methodist churches dotted the landscape, but they competed with older, more primal forms of spirituality. Creek baptisms were common, and revivals could last for weeks. People spoke of divine intervention and demonic possession with the same matter-of-fact tone they might use to discuss the weather. Angels and devils were as real as neighbors and livestock, and the line between the sacred and the supernatural was often blurred beyond recognition. Into this world of superstition and survival, Benjamin Ward grew from a mysterious child into an even more enigmatic young man. By 1883, when he was 15 years old, his reputation had spread throughout the region. People traveled from as far away as Springfield and Branson just to get a look at the boy who couldn't die, and what they saw left them more puzzled than enlightened. Benjamin was tall for his age, with the lean, wiry build common among Ozark men. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and his eyes were an unusual shade of gray-green that seemed to change color depending on the light. He was soft-spoken and polite, with none of the boastfulness that might be expected from someone with his reputation. In fact, he seemed almost embarrassed by the attention his survival stories attracted. But it was impossible to ignore the evidence. By the time Benjamin reached his 15th birthday, he had survived incidents that should have killed him multiple times over. He had fallen from cliffs that had shattered the bones of grown men. He had contracted diseases that had wiped out entire families. He had been lost in blizzards, trapped in cave-ins, and caught in flash floods that had claimed the lives of experienced woodsmen. Yet he always emerged unscathed, as if death itself had decided to pass him by. The Ward family cabin had become an unofficial pilgrimage site for those seeking answers to questions they couldn't even properly formulate. William Ward, a practical man who had little patience for supernatural speculation, grew increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. He had seen his son's miraculous survivals firsthand, but he preferred to attribute them to luck, divine providence, or simple toughness, rather than anything more mysterious. Laura Ward felt differently. She had always possessed an intuitive understanding of the forces that moved through the Ozark Hills, and she recognized that her son was touched by something beyond normal human experience. She kept detailed records of Benjamin's encounters with death, documenting not just the events themselves, but also the circumstances surrounding them, the reactions of witnesses, and her own observations about her son's behavior before and after each incident. These records, preserved in the Ward family Bible and discovered decades later by a local historian, provide our most reliable account of Benjamin's extraordinary life. They reveal a pattern that becomes more disturbing the more closely it's examined. Benjamin didn't just survive life-threatening situations. He seemed to be drawn to them, as if some invisible force was testing the limits of his mortality. The first major incident that established Benjamin's reputation throughout the region occurred in the spring of 1879, when he was 11 years old. The winter had been particularly harsh, with heavy snows that had isolated most Ozark families for months. When the spring thaw finally came, it brought with it devastating floods that reshaped the landscape and claimed numerous lives throughout the region. Big Sugar Creek, normally a peaceful waterway that meandered gently through the valleys, became a raging torrent that swept away everything in its path. The Ward family, like most of their neighbors, stayed well away from the creek during the flood season. But Benjamin, driven by the same curiosity that had led him into the wilderness as a 3-year-old, was drawn to the thundering waters like a moth to flame. On a warm April morning, while William was repairing flood damage to their barn and Laura was tending to her vegetable garden, Benjamin slipped away from the homestead and made his way to the creek. What he found there was a scene of awesome destruction. The normally placid stream had transformed into a brown, churning monster that had risen 15 feet above its normal banks. Entire trees, some of them massive oaks that had stood for centuries, were being tossed about like twigs. The sound was deafening, a constant roar that could be heard for miles. Most people would have been terrified by such a display of nature's power. Benjamin, according to his own later account, was mesmerized. He climbed onto a large boulder that jutted out over the raging waters and sat there for hours, watching the flood carry away pieces of the world he had known. It was on this boulder that Martha Henley, a neighbor woman who had come looking for her own missing son, found him late that afternoon. Martha's scream of alarm was audible even over the roar of the flood. Benjamin was sitting calmly on a rock that was being constantly battered by debris and spray, seemingly oblivious to the danger. The boulder itself was partially submerged, and waves were breaking over Benjamin's feet with enough force to knock a grown man into the torrent. Yet there he sat, as relaxed as if he were enjoying a gentle summer shower. Martha ran back to the Ward homestead and frantically alerted William and Laura to their son's predicament. By the time they reached the creek, a small crowd had gathered. Word of the boy's situation had spread quickly through the community, and people had come from miles around to witness what many assumed would be a tragedy. The rescue presented an almost impossible challenge. The flood had washed away every bridge and ford for 20 miles in either direction. The current was too strong for even the most experienced swimmers, and the water was filled with debris that could easily kill anyone who entered it. Several men tried to approach Benjamin from upstream, hoping to throw him a rope, but the terrain and the violence of the flood made it impossible to get close enough. As the afternoon wore on and the situation grew more desperate, people began to discuss the grim possibility that they would have to watch the boy die. The boulder he was sitting on was gradually being undermined by the current, and it was only a matter of time before it shifted or broke apart entirely. Benjamin himself seemed unconcerned by his predicament. Witnesses reported that he appeared to be talking to someone, though there was clearly no one else on the rock with him. Then, just as the sun was beginning to set and hope was nearly exhausted, something extraordinary happened. The flood began to recede. Not gradually, as would be expected, but rapidly and dramatically. Within the space of an hour, the water level dropped by more than 10 feet, revealing a pathway of exposed rocks and fallen logs that led directly to Benjamin's boulder. Thomas McKinney, a local farmer known for his steady nerves and sure footing, was able to pick his way across this improvised bridge and reach the boy. Benjamin greeted him with a smile and a casual, "Howdy, Mr. McKinney," as if they had encountered each other on a Sunday stroll, rather than in the middle of a life-threatening rescue. The speed of the flood's recession was unprecedented in local memory. Dr. Cohn, who had arrived on the scene hoping to treat what he assumed would be a drowning victim, was among the witnesses who recorded the event. In his journal, which was donated to the Springfield Historical Society many years later, he wrote, "I have lived in this region for 37 years and have witnessed many floods. Never have I seen waters rise and fall with such unnatural speed. It was as if the creek itself had decided to spare the boy's life." But the mystery didn't end with Benjamin's rescue. When Thomas McKinney reached the boulder, he made a discovery that would be talked about for decades. The rock on which Benjamin had been sitting, a massive limestone formation that had been a local landmark for generations, was split cleanly in half. The crack ran from top to bottom, creating a perfect fissure that hadn't existed when the boy first climbed onto the stone. More puzzling still, Benjamin's clothes were completely dry, despite hours of exposure to spray and waves that should have soaked him to the skin. His shirt, pants, and boots showed no signs of moisture. When Dr. Cohn examined him, he found no evidence of hypothermia, dehydration, or distress. Benjamin's body temperature was normal, his pulse was steady, and his demeanor was calm to the point of being unsettling. In the days that followed, people began to notice other strange details about the incident. The flood had left a distinctive high water mark throughout the region, showing exactly holders. You high, the waters had risen. But around the boulder where Benjamin had sat, the mark was significantly lower, as if the water had somehow avoided that particular spot. Debris that should have been scattered throughout the area was arranged in neat piles, as though someone had carefully organized it. Most disturbing of all were the reports from witnesses who claimed to have seen a woman in white standing in the water near Benjamin's boulder. At least 6 people, including Martha Henley and Dr. Cohn, swore they had observed this figure during the most dangerous moments of the rescue. She appeared to be standing directly in the raging current, completely unaffected by the power of the flood. Some witnesses said she seemed to be gesturing toward Benjamin as if guiding or protecting him. When questioned about this mysterious woman, Benjamin's responses were vague and contradictory. Sometimes he claimed to have seen her. Sometimes he denied any knowledge of her existence. When pressed for details, he would become quiet and withdrawn, as if discussing the subject caused him genuine distress. The only consistent element in his various accounts was his description of her voice, which he said sounded like singing water, and had kept him calm throughout his ordeal. The flood incident marked a turning point in how the community viewed Benjamin Ward. What had previously been dismissed as childhood accidents or remarkable luck was now seen as something far more significant. People began to pay closer attention to the boy's activities, and what they observed only deepened the mystery surrounding him. Benjamin seemed to possess an uncanny ability to sense danger before it manifested. He would avoid certain paths through the forest on days when other travelers encountered bears or snakes. He would refuse to enter buildings that later suffered structural collapses. He would change his plans for no apparent reason, only to learn later that his original route had been blocked by landslides or flash floods. But more than just avoiding danger, Benjamin appeared to be actively drawn to situations that would prove fatal to others. He was present at every major accident, natural disaster, or life-threatening emergency in the region between 1879 and 1883. And in every case, he not only survived, but seemed to emerge stronger and more confident than before. Dr. Matthias Cohn, the region's only trained physician, began keeping detailed records of Benjamin's various encounters with death. A graduate of Harvard Medical School who had come to the Ozarks seeking a quiet practice, Dr. Cohn found himself confronting medical mysteries that challenged everything he had learned about human physiology and survival. In his private journal, Dr. Cohn documented at least 15 separate incidents between 1879 and 1883 in which Benjamin Ward should have died. These ranged from exposure to deadly diseases to physical trauma that would have killed grown men. In each case, Benjamin not only survived, but showed no lasting effects from his ordeal. The cholera outbreak of 1880 provides a particularly striking example. The disease, which had been carried into the region by travelers from Kansas City, swept through the Ozark communities like wildfire. Entire families were wiped out within days of the first symptoms appearing. Dr. Cohn worked around the clock, but with no understanding of how the disease spread and no effective treatments available, he could do little more than comfort the dying. Benjamin Ward was among the first to be exposed to the disease. He had been helping care for the Morrison family, whose farm was located about 5 miles from the Ward homestead. All 7 members of the Morrison family died within a week of falling ill, and Benjamin had been in close contact with them throughout their final days. By all medical logic, he should have contracted the disease and died alongside them. Instead, Benjamin remained perfectly healthy. Not only did he show no symptoms of cholera, but he seemed to possess an unusual immunity to the disease. Dr. Cohn documented several instances in which Benjamin entered homes where cholera victims lay dying, stayed for hours providing comfort and assistance, and emerged without any sign of infection. More remarkably still, Benjamin's presence seemed to have a beneficial effect on some cholera victims. Dr. Cohn recorded 3 separate cases in which patients who had been expected to die made sudden, inexplicable recoveries after spending time with Benjamin. These recoveries were so dramatic and unexpected that Dr. Cohn initially suspected he had misdiagnosed the original illness. But subsequent examination confirmed that these patients had indeed been suffering from cholera and had been near death when Benjamin visited them. The pattern was consistent and undeniable, but it was also impossible to explain using any medical knowledge available at the time. Dr. Cohn consulted with colleagues in St. Louis and Kansas City, sharing his observations and seeking explanations for Benjamin's apparent immunity and healing abilities. The responses he received ranged from skepticism to accusations of incompetence. Several physicians suggested that Dr. Cohn had been living in isolation for too long and was allowing local superstitions to cloud his medical judgment. But Dr. Cohn knew what he had observed, and he continued to document Benjamin's extraordinary encounters with death. The consumption epidemic of 1881 provided another opportunity to study the boy's unusual abilities. Tuberculosis was endemic in the Ozark region, where poor nutrition, inadequate housing, and limited medical care created ideal conditions for the disease to flourish. Benjamin's exposure to consumption was extensive and repeated. He worked alongside his father in the blacksmith shop, which served customers from throughout the region. Many of these customers were already showing symptoms of the disease, coughing up blood and struggling to breathe in the smoke-filled environment of the smithy. Benjamin also attended church services and community gatherings where infected individuals mingled freely with healthy neighbors. Once again, Benjamin remained completely unaffected. Dr. Cohn tested him repeatedly for signs of tuberculosis infection, using every diagnostic method available at the time. The results were consistently negative. Benjamin's lungs were clear, his breathing was normal, and he showed no symptoms of the disease that was claiming lives throughout the community. But Benjamin's immunity to consumption was only part of the story. As with the cholera outbreak, his presence seemed to have a positive effect on some tuberculosis sufferers. Dr. Cohn documented multiple cases in which patients experienced temporary improvements in their condition after spending time with Benjamin. These improvements were typically brief, lasting only a few days or weeks, but they were significant enough to be noticed by family members and other caregivers. The most dramatic case involved Rebecca Lawson, a young woman from a prominent Springfield family who had been diagnosed with advanced tuberculosis. Rebecca's condition had deteriorated to the point where Dr. Cohn expected her to die within days. Her family had already begun making funeral arrangements when they heard about Benjamin Ward's reputation and decided to seek his help as a last resort. Benjamin spent an entire afternoon at Rebecca's bedside, talking quietly with her and holding her hand. According to witnesses, including Dr. Cohn himself, Rebecca's condition began to improve almost immediately. Her fever broke, her breathing became easier, and her coughing subsided. Within a week, she was able to sit up and take solid food. Within a month, she appeared to be completely recovered. Dr. Cohn was initially ecstatic about Rebecca's recovery, believing he had witnessed a genuine medical miracle. But his excitement was short-lived. 6 weeks after her apparent cure, Rebecca suffered a sudden relapse that was far more severe than her original illness. She died within hours, her body ravaged by a form of tuberculosis that Dr. Cohn had never encountered before. The post-mortem examination revealed lung damage that was far more extensive than should have been possible given the timeline of her illness. This pattern of temporary improvement, followed by catastrophic decline, became a recurring theme in Benjamin's interactions with the seriously ill. It was as if his presence could delay death, but not prevent it. And when death finally came, it was often more violent and final than would have occurred naturally. Dr. Cohn began to suspect that Benjamin's abilities came with a terrible price. In his journal, he wrote, "The boy seems to borrow time from death itself, but death always collects its debt with interest. I fear that those who benefit from his touch may be trading a quick, merciful end for prolonged suffering and ultimate agony." But even this dark theory couldn't explain all of Benjamin's encounters with mortality. There were incidents that seemed to defy not just medical understanding, but the basic laws of physics and nature. The cave-in at what locals called Devil's Den provided one of the most thoroughly documented examples of Benjamin's supernatural survival abilities. Devil's Den was a natural cave system located about 8 miles southwest of the Ward homestead, near what is now known as Marvel Cave. The caverns had been formed over thousands of years by underground streams, creating a maze of passages and chambers that extended deep into the earth. Local children and young adults often explored the more accessible portions of Devil's Den, despite repeated warnings from their elders about the dangers of cave exploration. The limestone formations were unstable, the passages were poorly mapped, and it was easy to become lost in the winding tunnels. Several people had died in the caves over the years, and their bodies had never been recovered. In the summer of 1882, Benjamin Ward joined a group of young people from the Springfield area for what was intended to be a routine exploration of Devil's Den. The group included 2 experienced local guides who knew the cave system well and had explored it safely numerous times before. They planned to spend a few hours in the main chamber and some of the larger side passages before returning to the surface. What happened next was witnessed by 7 people and documented by Dr. Cohn, who interviewed each survivor separately within hours of the incident. According to their accounts, the group had been exploring for about 2 hours when they heard a deep, rumbling sound coming from somewhere above them. The sound grew louder and more ominous, and the ground beneath their feet began to shake. James Butler, one of the experienced guides, immediately recognized the signs of an impending cave-in. He shouted for everyone to head for the entrance as quickly as possible, but it was already too late. The ceiling of the main chamber began to collapse, sending tons of limestone crashing down into the cavern. The collapse happened with terrifying speed. Within seconds, the spacious chamber where the group had been exploring was filled with rubble. 6 of the 8 explorers managed to reach a side passage that remained intact, but Benjamin Ward and Mary Catherine Owens, a 16-year-old girl from Springfield, were trapped in the main chamber when the ceiling came down. The survivors worked frantically to clear the debris, but the amount of rock and earth that had fallen made rescue seem impossible. Dr. Cohn arrived at the scene within hours, along with every able-bodied man from the surrounding area. They worked in shifts for 3 full days, moving rocks by hand and digging through tons of rubble, but they found no sign of the 2 missing explorers. On the 4th day, when hope had been all but abandoned and discussions had turned to recovering bodies rather than rescuing survivors, they heard a sound that no one expected. It was Benjamin Ward's voice, calling out from somewhere deep within the collapsed chamber. He sounded calm and uninjured, as if he were merely asking for directions rather than crying out from beneath tons of fallen rock. The rescue effort was renewed with desperate intensity. Following the sound of Benjamin's voice, the searchers were able to locate a small air pocket that had somehow survived the collapse. When they finally broke through to this pocket after another full day of digging, they found Benjamin Ward sitting calmly in a space no larger than a coffin, completely unharmed and apparently unbothered by his 4-day entombment. But Mary Catherine Owens was nowhere to be found. Benjamin claimed that she had been with him immediately after the collapse, but that she had gone away during the 2nd night. When pressed for details about what had happened to her, Benjamin became vague and distressed, saying only that the lady in white came and took her to a better place. Mary Catherine's body was never recovered, despite extensive searches of the remaining cave system. The collapse had sealed off most of the passages, making thorough exploration impossible. But Dr. Cohn and several other investigators believed that there was more to the story than Benjamin was willing to share. More disturbing still were the fizzes. I call impossibilities surrounding Benjamin's survival. The air pocket where he was found was completely sealed off from the outside world. There was no source of fresh air, no water, and certainly no food. By all scientific understanding, Benjamin should have suffocated within hours of the collapse. Instead, he had survived for 4 full days in an environment that should have been lethal within minutes. When Dr. Cohn examined Benjamin after his rescue, he found no signs of dehydration, starvation, or oxygen deprivation. Benjamin's vital signs were normal, his mental state was clear, and his physical condition was actually better than it had been before he entered the cave. It was as if the 4 days of entombment had somehow nourished rather than depleted him. The mystery deepened when investigators examined the air pocket itself. The space was too small and irregularly shaped to have formed naturally during the collapse. It appeared to have been carefully carved out of the surrounding rock, with smooth walls and a level floor that showed signs of deliberate construction. But there were no tools in the pocket, no evidence of excavation, and no explanation for how such precise work could have been accomplished in the midst of a catastrophic cave-in. Most puzzling of all were the symbols that had been carved into the walls of the air pocket. These weren't random scratches or desperate messages from a trapped victim. They were intricate designs that resembled no alphabet or writing system that Dr. Cohn or any of the other investigators had ever seen. The symbols appeared to have been carved with precision and care, using tools that Benjamin couldn't possibly have possessed while trapped underground. When questioned about these symbols, Benjamin claimed to have no memory of creating them. He said that he had spent most of his time underground sleeping, and that when he was awake, it had been too dark to see anything clearly. But several witnesses reported that Benjamin's fingernails, which should have been, and broken and bloody from clawing at rock, were perfectly clean and neatly trimmed when he was rescued. The devil's